And I'd like to welcome Jane Hume now. Senator Jane Hume has a lot on her plate. She's the Assistant Minister responsible for both super and financial services, and she also chairs the Senate Economics Legislation Committee.
Yeah, she's got about the best background for it, though, having worked for NAB, Rothschild, Deutsche and industry fund Australian Super. Well, Senator Jane Hume joins us now live from Canberra. Senator Hume, a big welcome to you. Nice to have you on the show. Can I ask you first...
It's terrific to be here. Thank you, Tiki. I've got to correct you, first of all. I'm no longer the chair of the Senate Economics Committee.
You're former.
I'm afraid that honour has fallen to Slade Brockman.
Yes, but we'll pick you up on it because you obviously like that space as well. And I've got an economist here. But let me ask you first with your super hat on, Jane. You've obviously got a lot of work coming. How is government going to respond to the Productivity Commission report, which has been sitting there for a while, and in particular things like the idea of a top 10 best in show and some of these more controversial areas?
Yeah, look, the Productivity Commission report was very broad-ranging and came up with a number of recommendations. Some of those have already been adopted, and you know that the Treasurer has said that we're going to conduct a retirement incomes review in the next, imminently, and that was one of the productivity recommendations. Other recommendations the government will respond to in due course, but obviously there's an awful lot on the legislative agenda, particularly in the Treasury portfolio with our response to the Hayne-Roll Commission. You know, the Treasury portfolio is already around a quarter of everything that the government does, and of that quarter, about 75% will be taken up with Hayne-Roll Commission recommendations. And then there's the budget on top of that. So we've got an awful lot to do.
When are we going to see this? Because it is quite a controversial area, and it's of concern for a lot of ordinary Australian savers that their money has either been defaulted into unproductive funds. I mean, how are we going to move on this so that savers do know that they've got their super nest performing for them?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a couple of issues here. One is the response to the Productivity Commission, and that, as I said, will happen in due course. The best-in-show solution, which was put forward by the Productivity Commission, has a lot of merit. It's been debated considerably in the industry, and the government will respond to that in due course.
What's due course,
but you're absolutely right. There has been some considerable changes already made in the superannuation space. One of the things that Productivity Commission picked up on was that multiple accounts are causing balances to be less in retirement, and the Protecting Your Super package, which was announced in the 2018 budget and was passed just prior to the election, has already begun to reunite those multiple accounts, those duplicate accounts, which will make the system far more efficient. We've also reduced fees for low balance accounts, but there is more to be done, and that's why this week the putting members' interests
Minister, can I just pause you there on the issue of fees? You mentioned fees here. I'm just wondering, the average level of fees in the super sector overall has only come down very, very slightly in recent years. I think it's still about 110 basis points, 1.1%, which most experts say is far too high. Do you have a rough idea of what would be a reasonable level of fees on average throughout the system?
Well, look, on international comparisons, I think we can safely say that we're probably somewhere between 40 and 50 basis points out of step. There is an awful lot to do in this space, but fees have. You're right. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And fees have come down, and they will continue to do so. Choosing the right default mechanism may have a very significant effect on that.
One of the recommendations from the Productivity Commission was to have a review into the overall impact of the superannuation system on the retirement saving system. Now, I understand that the government has agreed to that, but we still don't have any idea of who is going to do that review or when it's going to start.
Yes, well, the terms of reference of that review is something that the government will release very soon, and you'll get a much better idea of exactly what that's going to encompass. I think the Productivity Commission made it clear that what it wanted to have a better handle of was how the superannuation system connected with the pension system, how it connected with national savings, just to give us a broad idea of what the impacts of this now 28-year-old system, this now $2.9 trillion system is having on national savings and also the interaction with the pension. How do we make it as efficient as possible?
All right. Can I go to the relationship of business with government, because you've got a lot of chief executives that the BCA is bringing to Canberra next week. And in the recent past, we've had Treasurer Josh Frydenberg bashing business over the head about the amount of dividends paid out and put money back into growth. We've very recently had the Prime Minister's Assistant Minister, Ben Morgan, attacking business for doing too much on ESG, on sort of climate change stuff, rather than for workers. We've got the big stick legislation coming in energy, but businesses worried that it might be more than that. What can we do about this relationship? Because it's a bit rocky at the moment, isn't it?
No, look, I reject that. I don't think it's rocky. However, government is not here to further the cause of big business. We can see that there has been some frustration with businesses, and superannuation is the best example, where you've seen directors or trustees becoming activists, using their power as activists, as opposed to putting the interests of their members first. And I think that is probably where the frustration lies. Business has a very important role. Government has a very important role in making sure that the levers are right to allow business to get on with what it is that they do best.
Do you think that's particularly the case in corporate Australia, or having worked at Aussie Super, for example, do you think that's industry funds are particularly susceptible to, say, climate change pressure? How do you view this?
Well, I think that what we've seen is a number of trustees within super funds perhaps stepping outside of their remit. Look, ESG is in fine, of course. I mean, that's a basic investment filter. But when you start, putting the pressure on for things like industrial relations changes within the companies that you are investing in, I think that maybe we are going beyond the pale there. The most important thing from a government's perspective is to put Australians, ordinary Australians first, the quiet Australians first. From a superannuation fund's perspective, it's to put their members' interests first.
Minister, can I just broaden the discussion now to the economy? Of course, we saw some pretty sorry growth figures in the second quarter, 1.4% over the year, the slowest pace since the financial crisis. The government seems to be pretty confident that the third quarter will show some sort of improvement, but we've already seen that retail sales in July went backwards. We've seen a series of other indicators, the business survey, for instance, that showed very weak confidence. Are you confident that the third quarter will see a bounce in growth?
Well, I think that what we did see was a number of people talking down the performance of the economy which has grown consecutively now every quarter for 28 years. I mean, that is a world-breaking record. And in a quarter where we saw negative growth from countries like the UK, from Singapore, from Germany, Australia continued to grow.
It must be said that their population growth is a lot slower than ours.
Would we like those growth figures to be better? Would we like those growth figures to be better? Of course we would, and that's why government's job is to get the settings right, to allow businesses to grow. One of the things that I think we've seen in the last 6 years, even in the face of these economic headwinds, even in the face of, the storm clouds over the China and the US trade tensions, is a consistent growth in Australian business, largely due, I think, to things like the number of free trade agreements that have been negotiated by this government. When we came into government, only 20% of the bilateral trade that we did was covered by a free trade agreement. Now it's nearly 75%, and there is more to come. This is what government's role is to till the soil to allow the private sector to do its job well.
In terms of government's role there, Minister, I wanted to ask you a quick question about the so-called big stick legislation. I want to know why it's reasonable to focus on just one sector of the economy when, for instance, the banks would be excluded from the proposed legislation to break up the energy companies.
Yeah, look, I mean, I understand the hesitation with this legislation. However, it's important to know that, the divestment powers, which of course is what it is that businesses are most frightened of or cautious of, already exists in our takeover laws, in our foreign investment laws, and they also exist in other jurisdictions. And the sky has not fallen in. I think that this is just one tool in the armoury, and that business shouldn't have the knee-jerk reaction that it's having.
All right, Senator Jane Hume, we are out of time, but thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Great to be with you, Tiki. Thanks, Adam.